This is the Panopticast. Conversations at the edge of freedom.
Then we tend to look at it, so everyone's on what, team church or team state, or you know, like if you've got the civilian perspective of you know, the sort of rationalist down with the church, and then you've got the typical religious perspective, to use the two most dominant ones. But they're both just expressions of the same human sort of proclivity towards power, manifest and concentrated in blocks, right? And I think, and this comes back to the sovereignty thing, like unless you look at it like that, you can't really see the value of the idea of sovereignty at its absolute core, because are you out for the individual or not? Because it's not that there's church and state, it's that church and state are just two expressions of removing sovereignty from the individual. And obviously with religion, church and religion are obviously there's blurry lines here, but like if the you know, the sort of positive expression of religion for sovereignty, if it's anything that's to the ends of individual sovereignty, fine. And the state does a little bit of that, and church does a little bit of that. Everything does a little bit of that, because it's the best sales pitch to get you on team anyway, right? But ultimately, I think unless people are coming at it from the direction of everything outside of me is trying to dominate me for its own survival. Yeah. And even if maybe we're actually living in a more optimistic universe than that, and it's not quite as dark as that, I'd say especially now, like it pays to just be you know, precautionary principle, to be a little bit overly cynical even, and assume everything outside of me is trying to control me, other than maybe my children and my own core family. Well, exactly, it goes forever. But like applying it that way, it just gives you a more realist cynicism about any of those structures, and you're forced to come back to individual sovereignty for me and perpetuating it for other people as well. As well, what this does, this gets around the factor of your own. I mean, I think I want sovereignty for other individuals. I'm confident that I want it for my children and my wife and my family. I'm certain. And I think that even if there's some degree of psychological self-delusion or something misaligned, my instincts will compel me to look after my children and my wife and myself. And then I'm pretty certain I want it for my fellow man. But I don't know that tested I'm gonna stick around too long for the wounded person when my children might be over there or whatever, and where that balance is. So what the sovereignty as a core ideal and ethic does in promoting sovereignty for me and sovereignty for this other person as almost as a church, as something that this is unassailable. This is a goal that we're reaching for everyone. It takes you out almost in a dogmatic kind of way. It takes you out of the potential psychological loops that could have you trying to control that person. If you constantly pull back into check by no, I'm compromising this person's sovereignty, then you're dogmatically, in a good sense, held in check to potentially mitigate any of your own unseen psychological games you might play in order to compromise that person's sovereignty for your own ends. So it's absolute core. It's like it's got that kind of almost a founding fathers philosophy style mitigation of all the things that just do go wrong. Let's just accept it as individuals, as societies. Never mind why. This is what we do. We've done it every fucking time. And something like that the sovereignty thing for me, that's what it does. It feels like a recapitulation of the kind of philosophical wisdom that the founding fathers were spouting.
Yeah, but you know, beyond that, like Christ, because
that's it. And you can,
and I think like, so yeah, you were saying church and religion, yeah, you know, probably, and you know, presumably, I mean, I don't know this well enough, but this is my assumption. Like, you know, the sort of Luther and the Protestant Reformation was a massive, I mean, it was literally, I guess, a grab away from the Catholic Church and the actual material manifestation of that in the Vatican and so on. But it was also an individualizing of faith in terms of we don't, this relationship with God is not mediated. We have a direct relationship with Him. I think it coincided with the ability for the growing ability for the populace themselves to read the scripts, so they could have a direct relation through the book. But then even in terms of how that interpolated people as individuals, I think if you're doing something like Foucauldian around the genealogy of the individual, those, presumably probably in other bygone eras there might have been things closer to that as well in more tribal societies, whatever degree of collectivism wrapped around that. But that moment probably was a founding moment for humanism, probably, because these are kind of religious concepts that then have can have secularized versions of them in a sense, in a way like the international human rights regime could be seen as a secularization of that divine notion that there's. And so if you've then constructed a religious, or if you've deconstructed in a way a previous religious dogma to then put the individual as primary in their direct relationship to God, whilst also wrapping around that a kind of it's that relationship to judgment, isn't it? And if the judgment is simply based in these people's language around a kind of notion of natural law, which you could probably strip down to do unto others as you would have done unto yourself, and then how is that manifest in the he who's without sin cast the first stone, etc., etc. That's really powerful, and it's placing individual sovereignty within a more, with some kind of grounding principle. So if the grounding principle is God and people believe in that, then that works pretty well. Now, what's the grounding principle? The UN? Who's backing this international human rights regime? Do you know what I mean? Who's backing it?
They're all putting stock in inherently corrupt institutions. And you don't even have to get into the conversation about, is the UN corrupt? Was it always intended to be corrupt? You don't even have to get into that conversation. You just have to work on on the basis
on
of
that kind of realist
precedent. Just looking at a system, taking a systems approach and saying, I can't tell you that it is corrupt. I can just tell you that if it isn't, it's the first example in the history of human systems where it wouldn't be corrupt in the end.
And I'm being facetious to some extent, because ultimately, the UN, either it's got real teeth and it's like a global government, and do people want that, or it isn't. It hasn't really got any teeth. So what you actually see is this application of it in the interests of broader geopolitics. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
We'll criticise this human rights abuse because you're a weak state and you're not aligned with the West, whatever. But when the US and UK are getting involved in illegal wars, it's kind of it's by the by. Or when everyone's human rights get trampled on for a disease that's 0.03% infection fatality. Well, just imagine if it did, sort of. So there isn't that foundation, and I think this is why, again, that's what's happening in these spaces that I was describing, is that spiritual connection. And I think you can transfer that into then the more modern forms of spirituality. Do you know what I mean? Which is if you think of Protestantism, I guess, as a direct relationship with truth, God is truth. That is where truth lies. Everything else is kind of, the material world that is the 2D world, as they would. Do you know what I mean? The material.
It's funny how the languages are coming back. The language of kind of hip, sensible, woke in the original sort of sense of that word. People just being sort of switched on and knowing what's going on. All of the sort of parameters of their view of the world is starting to look very religious, very like the old.
So if you went and to those types of communities, let's just say, and I resonate with a lot of this. It's if you sort of where truth is, you'll get it's here, isn't it? It's
got an emotional power more than an intellectual power.
And it's got a very people people start saying my truth and all this stuff, but I think there's a sense that it's they might say, for example, a connection with source. Do you know what I mean? It's about removing the shadow, and it's about getting to the core and people being in their truth and all the rest of it. Again, it's a very similar notion, right? Because I don't think ultimately they're saying my truth. They're saying a shared truth once we rid ourselves of the bullshit. Once we do the
Yeah,
work
the
and
emphasis
address
is
the
more
shadow.
on not their truth. It's not that it's not my truth distinct from everyone else's
Yeah,
truth.
yeah.
It's not their,
It's
not the
it's
truth
not the
that's being
system's
pushed
truth,
at me.
because
Yeah,
the system is let's just expand the metaphor. The system is Luciferian. The system is based on neuro-linguistic programming, like deceit, deception,
power asymmetry,
asymmetry,
monopoly.
corruption of like. Whereas what we're trying to do is purify ourselves from that. Return to the sacred. All this language is there. Return to the truth. And I don't think it's, you're right. It's not their truth, but it's a truth that, if shared, if this spiritual revolution were to sweep across the world, we would be able to live in harmony, right? Because we would be rid of the of Satan trying to tempt us in the desert, and so so the state as a false idol, and the corporations and the whole shit and then if you want to layer on, which they often does with the conspiratorial thing, is then actually there is genuine satanic. It's not just a metaphor.
As evident manifesting.
But do you know what I mean? Either way, it's the very same thing, and that's then when I think. That's why, with what I'm thinking about, this relationship between sort of spiritual communities and natural law, what I realised in talking to that guy and in listening to some of this stuff, it's the two things are not separate, because I guess I didn't twig with the way in which out of that original religious thing did come the law, if you like. Do you know what I mean?
It is the ancestry of a lot of what we value now.
Yeah, and how legal systems sort of evolved out of that. And this guy's point is that, if you actually go back through the Constitution, like the manifestation of common law coming from this, like, let's just call it like this sort of historic theology or whatever, hasn't, the system has always wanted to undermine that, but it was older than that, and it was manifesting these kind of principles and values, and it's only, it's been slowly eroded. And he gave the example, and it's hilarious, really. And I'd seen it before, like on some video, but in China they're starting to use AI as a judge in courts, right? Because and he was saying, like, and this is very Agambennian as well, like, that assumes that this is simply an algorithm, these are just rules, whereas if you accept that actually this is divine consciousness in terms of judging peers on intent and all the nuances around it, it's not just the application of fixed rules, like Agamben says at one point. And just to flesh this out, because I think it's quite cool, like, one of the things around the sort of Homo Sarka and the separation of Bios and Zoe is that, Agamben's view is a form of life is when these things are not separate. There's not like this structure that's creating laws that are then essentially controlling living beings, if you like, but they're not integrated, they're like external. That's why he used the monastic tradition as an example. No, it's actually people should self-form, or communities should self-form their own rules, and those rules are much more flexible. And at one point it's quite evocative and sort of obscure in a way, but it says, the law should be, should have the same relationship as a child playing with a toy. It should be creative and reformed. And in the context of what I was just describing with the common law, these people are not just applying rules that, like, the administrative state may have made up. They're saying, is this just? Is this fair? If I was in that,
coming back to core, that's the root of the name. Obviously, they're coming back to core values that can be experienced and internally witnessed at any moment for any person. It's rooted in that idea that there's something internally oriented, and even if you get into philosophical discussion about whether or not that's just rational self-interest and I want what's best for you and all that, the point is, at any given moment, someone who's not mentally ill, you can appeal to these values, core human values and common laws that as they manifest, and find agreement, and most importantly, find agreement with yourself. So it's as a guiding principle in a way. So just to put, because I think it's overall this is a good way to have this as as something to put in the net stuff, like so that whole angle, that sort of from one angle a reassessment of religion and what value it can be in its overlap with this, not even overlap with, it's just total inescapable integration with sovereignty and all the concepts of sovereignty and common law and everything. And then on the other hand, the thing that I've kept coming back to a lot of evaluation of reverence and like reconnection with nature, and even just as again in a very core, any human being can get this kind of way, the idea that and it's the same thing in a sense, because the like we'd said just before we started, then we said about there's a value, an inherent value just in elevating something above yourself, even if it's source or whatever, right? In having something that you are beholden to, you are sort of a derivative of, right? Because anything else is hubris. Anything as soon as you don't have something that you can hold above you, even if it's values, then what you get, look around, you get what we've got. And the entire Western civilization is built on, like irreverence has become like a good word. If you say like, that person's irreverent, it's almost got to like, no, you're not gonna overpower me with your reverent ideas. Yeah.
Although it's often used in terms of
it is more used
social
in the sense,
and state laws,
but
isn't it?
Which
in itself is interesting again because it's religious.
It's now we've got to the point where it's almost like there's so much corruption that your best defense mechanism is to be irreverent to everything around you. Don't revere anything because you can't trust it. It's all corrupt.
That's really interesting, right? Because it's irreverence against and this is, I think, where all radical movements are going. Like this dawned on me. A conversation I was having with someone. Like it's about the sacred versus the profane, and I think we've got profane. You could say corruption or whatever, but the corruption of the food, the impurities,
everything
and
that is
the
not
chemicals.
Good for the human.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then the need, therefore, to create sort of sacred spaces to protect against that profanity. And in order to do that, though, because the profanity is in here as well, people have to start, and this again comes back to that form of life and Agamben and all that stuff. People have to, and they have done since like, well, I've got a book by a guy called Haddock now. I think I mentioned about how the philosophical schools going back to Plato and Aristotle and the Cynics and the Stoics, all the rest of it. These weren't what philosophy is now, which is an academic discipline that's predominantly sort of discursive. Yeah, only solidified.
Rather than inquiring.
Yeah, but also it's not. I mean, they would argue they're inquiring and so on, but it's about propositions and logical arguments within that and justification.
I think there is
it's not a way of life. It's not a way of life.
Yeah.
It's not, the reason that those schools were doing that was to change who they were through a set of ideas that then would become embodied in their practices. So like I can't pronounce the guy's name. I can't remember exactly what it is, but the main cynic in that school of thought, spent weeks or months just observing animals, and then it suddenly dawned on him that the snail carried his home on his back, and then decided that he was going to carry it. There's that artistic relationship to a kind of philosophical tradition, and then kind of spread the word, in almost a kind of messianic sort of or proselytizing sense within a school with it, and so the justification was for the way of life. So there are these, I think, again, if you think about the centre or if you think about any of these more modern spiritual communities, to the extent that they're not kind of just very sort of narrowly like self-development things, like they're trying to, there is a criticism of the profanity of the system and a form of, again, think about like Foucault's disciplinary society, like the society is disciplining children in the schools, military people in the barracks, etc. All these spaces that are trying to discipline minds and bodies through particular discourses that they then internalize and essentially program them down to even the kind of comportment and physicality. The needs, there has to be alternatives to that. We do need discipline, but can we self-discipline? That's sovereignty, right? That's something like that.
And a really vital thing though, as it's expressed now, like when you talk about spiritual communities and whatever else that are inherently you could almost see them as just an obvious, predictable reaction to the corruption or whatever, right? The counter, the biggest.
And that's what Christ was, right? Do you know?
Yeah,
but within the Roman Empire,
for sure. But then I think this is just like a caveat that needs tagging on the end of there for qualifying those kind of places, that kind of emerging, that those centres, those communities and stuff, that until we've got, when it goes back to hubris again and reverence, when we're looking and saying, look at all that corruption out there, is my response to it. I'm now going to manifest my response to it. Unless the work has been done, if you like, unless someone's aware that that corruption, in a sense, exists inside them in terms of psychological tendencies in certain directions, what they end up doing is they create the counter to the corruption, and it's just as corrupt as the corruption, and you've just got damaged psychological entities bouncing off each other. So it's like, what I would, just the caveat I tag on the end is that the critical important factor is the recognition that the corruption that you're seeing out there is almost identically expressed in you. And it can be argued, as the Jordan Peterson thing in a sense, it can be argued that the difference between my corruption and Henry Kissinger's corruption is that I'm more beholden to cultural values and what will my peers think of me and all this shit. And people in his situation are just a little bit more, due to being further towards that monopolistic apex, they get to just swing their bat a little bit wider, So I think you've got to have that level of humility in order for any of those emergent things to be
which
most valuable.
Which is also why I think this is about work on the self, like self-formation and community formation become important then, and that's what I guess in extremis then you get these cults that are corrupt versions of that, right? Because
I'd almost argue that the biggest, sorry to interrupt you very quickly, I'd almost argue that at the level of a human being at this moment in history looking around and saying, this is bullshit, this corruption, and I now want to react against it. That the irony is that the groups and situations they can drift into can end up being more harmful to them than this bigger scale corruption, because this is in the immediacy of their lives and their actual actions. They could become an active component in this corruption, whereas they can't in that corruption. So it's almost ironically a bigger threat than the big corruption, big C corruption.
Absolutely. So and the question is, this is why I think, because there's, do I want to go into this? I think so. So you could say wokeism.
I like it now and then when I actually hear your brain talking.
you could say wokeism, like people call it a new Puritanism, right? It's it's based on reasonable initial assumptions around forms of domination, like that everyone could agree, like if they're true and if they're there, we don't like domination, even going back to sovereign individuals, like we should try and anarchism, we should try and reduce and challenge domination wherever it materializes. And they take say claims around domination of men over women, or claims of domination of white over black, or whatever, and then so what you will see in some of these, like, let's just say, like, radical, like, left in relation to that issue, like, I have to tiptoe around this because of how I associate the left and what, but anyway, like,
it's a mess. We know it's a mess.
It's a mess, right? But saying those radical things, they will then see in a similar way the profanity of a patriarchal system, that's a mixture of capitalism and patriarchy and blah blah blah, and then create their own rules of purity within that, which can be things like, you get those, and again you have to dance around this because I'm not disagreeing around consent, but when it becomes like really quite sort of religious almost, and even married, even the expectations, if you're in a married couple, you're literally asking, you're asking for consent, and then if you start doing something else in a sort of within that sexual encounter, you ask for consent again. Do you know what I mean? Like, so
it becomes comical the way.
But these are the rules, right? So these are the same thing as what you're on about.
Yeah.
But there can be cases then where you can then take a position where, women are not believed enough, like, and I accept the statistics, I assume, like, that, the X number of rape claims, and it's a tiny proportion that actually end up being prosecuted, and I'm sure, like, there might be some bullshit in there, but I'm sure it's not whatever that, not 90%, right? It's probably 5% or 10% or whatever it is, right? So there's clearly, like, you look at that and it's maybe an unsolvable problem because there's got to be, assumption of innocence, and, you can't start, but but they look at that and it's like, okay, so we need to start believing women, like, and then they create these rules whereby like we'll just believe women, you know, and so there's cases where they like witch hunting men that have not even done anything.
Well,
like,
and it is
so,
you
so
use
this
the
is
right word with witch hunt,
Yeah.
well, because it's the it stands what you see with wokeism, and I don't even need to tiptoe around it to say this, because it's you would expect to see at any period in history, as corruption becomes intolerable to the human whatever, at the degree to which it becomes intolerable, a reaction is gonna push against enough. Just so those people who are moving into those communities, however you want to, anyone who looks around and says, I can't tolerate this anymore, like to whatever degree, and that can manifest in all kinds of ways in an individual's life. Yeah. The degree to which that incapacity to tolerate the corruption rises, a reaction will manifest. The problem is that reaction is manifesting within an environment dominated by this corruption. So a poor lack of education, as in just awareness about what's actually going on. What is that corruption? How is it corrupting you, and all the rest of it? So the reaction can end up being an overly simplistic one, like the way you were just laying out, or at least just a categorical, black and white. This is bad, therefore we'll now do this and we'll swing this way. So it's usually just not a nuanced response, because it's coming from within the domination of this system, which inherently has dominated the minds of these people, all of us, right? So it's a problematic response in that way, but it's also a problem. So there's two sides to this, I think. The first thing is the reaction that comes back is an overly simplistic one based on a lack of knowledge as a result of being on the shit end of this monopoly of power, right? No. Or the shit end of this corruption relationship. But then also, this gets into sort of controlled opposition. That if you are that system of corruption that's manifesting that way, it's as part of the continuance of your monopoly and to maintain the status quo. It's extremely easy with that level of power asymmetry to co-opt and create even the oppositional principles that are about to emerge before they've even emerged. So, and that is controlled opposition. So you get things, and I think this does apply to a lot of elements of the woke sort of thing. It applies for certain to any of the sort of 60s hippie counterculture cults that emerged. Anytime you see a really, in the historical picture, anytime you can point and say, whoa, that was a real moment when people were, you can very quickly just shift your gaze a little bit and see how it ended up. It's strange how it ended up manifesting as more of the same, or a perpetuation of the old norms. And it's because it's, if not co-opted by the forces that it's supposed to be pointing at, it's co-opted by the internally manifest forces that are a mirror of those forces they try to fight against.
Like, there's so many other things I want to say, but just on the planned opposition, like the guy, and I just thought this was like, I really liked his humility. This why I think he was.
The guy you were talking to about the common law stuff.
So obviously within this milieu now of the freedom movement or whatever, which is we talked about, it's very dispersed. But even if you take this segment,
I want to come back to the religion thing, because I wanted to try and make it clear.
Thing as well. But so I'll be brief on this, but it totally ties into exactly what you said. Is like everyone's planned opposition because of the internal program.
Yeah, exactly.
So
your proclivities
don't follow anyone. Don't follow anyone. Treat whatever anyone's producing. He goes, I see them as, he said, I've come from the corporate thing. Like, I see them as service providers, right? If they've got a tool that works in a particular given domain,
to reach in the ends of my values,
reach in a particular goal, even if that tool's been planted there, because it's not actually the broader solution, and it'll pull people down a kind of narrow alley, and they'll get into this little space and think this is the solution. It's like, I'm not bothered. And also, the broader point about recognizing, like, we're all said that we're all planned opposition because we've all got programming.
Because we're predictable more than anything else.
So two of the things on the religion thing, like the first is, that's why I think I'm more sympathetic, although obviously you can get a whole load of bullshit, and we can talk about this if you want, with the more quote-unquote spiritual aspect of that. So the work on the self, not from simply a programming of some new reactionary, in a sense, set of norms, to create as the sacred versus the profanity of the system, but as a kind of, like, let's just take the great spiritual teachers, like, and let's take a modern one, like Eckhart Tolle, in terms of that, like, you would struggle to think a community of Eckhart Tolles, do you know, are going to like, you know, they are actually, I would see that in sort of, again, in sort of Agamben's term as a form of destituent power operating at a local level, by which it means, like, you know, one of the things that you're trying to get out of, which comes to the sort of Hegelian dialectic thing, is every revolution, so there's constitutive power and constituted power. Like, constitutive power is where a new order emerges out of the old, usually through a revolution or through a kind of, you know, it could be a, I forgot the term, it doesn't matter.
New constitution.
Yeah, it could be a one that's done, let's just say, by a coup d'etat. You know, it could be like one within the power system, either hidden or visible. You know, like, you know, you talk about Kennedy or whatever, do you know what I mean? So it could be like a hidden one where essentially it might not be fully visible, but, you know, the previous constitution is being annulled in certain ways, and the balance of power that was manifest in that. Or it could be through a revolution, popular revolution or whatever, you know, French Revolution, American Revolution, etc. But then, so Benjamin refers to it like as constituting violence and then constituted violence, because then the new laws apply and are manifest through the violence of the state and the police and all the kind of architecture that then comes around that. And so he kind of Benjamin asks what is divine, you know, he frames it in terms of divine violence, but it's more obscure. So I like this idea of destituent power, because, like, there's constituting power, there's constituted power, and then there's destituent power. And this is sort of where Agamben ends up. Like, how do
What's destituent power?
Well, it's like, I mean, it's...
And what,
you know,
the constituted power and another one? I didn't get what that one
So
was.
yeah, constituting and then constituted. So it's the revolution that creates the new order, that undermines the previous constituted power, whether that, you know, if that was the monarchical system or whatever. And then you get a new constitution, whether it's written or not, that manifests the new values or principles of a new regime, and you get a new form of constituted power.
What's destituent power?
Well, I mean, it's slightly obscure, and like, it's something that I'm reading about, so I'm, you know, I'd probably get picked apart by anyone. But it's a form of power that, I guess, refuses to be reconstituted, that is more about disarticulating any forms of capture and power.
Kind of like common law.
Yeah, I guess it could
an
be.
inherent factor that somehow stands above the shenanigans of these new and the new order, the constituent decision,
and that's more flexible. So I guess when Agamben's looking at the you know, in this book called The Highest Poverty, around this monastic tradition, I think it links to that internalization of, you know, of the rules as a way of life, like they had in the monastic order, that weren't rigid, and like when he was saying, like a child that plays with it, that were because they were embedded in a form of life, you know, a kind of way of being, you know, they remained flexible. They were never fully constituted. So, you know, it's a kind of, you know, I guess it's philosophical and nuanced. But what I would say, potentially, I'm just pulling this out of my arse in a way, but the thing with, like, Eckhart Tolle, to take that position further,
using Eckhart Tolle as an example, just to clarify, using him as an example of a sort of a non-oppressive, kind of a neutralizing in the middle balance, not politically active and not ideological, but
also quote unquote doing the work. So, you know, you could reduce that individual, like, if we talked about constituted and constituted a kind of political system, but you could say about that about the individual, right? So you could say, oh, I was like that in my teens, and I went through this process, and then I re-emerged, and then, you know, and this was like me, which is a similar sort of process. And I guess the kind of, you know, I'm stretching things here, right? But, you know, it's like, it could be like, oh, I went and I had some therapy, you know, based on psychoanalytical principles or whatever, and that did that. Like, whereas Eckhart Tolle would be like, you just, you know, it would maybe never verbalize it as this, but it's like, you just taking one programming and replacing it with another one. Like, the actual enlightened sense is to recognize there is no you. You are just sort of being underneath that, you know. And
and also that sorry, you finish what you're saying, because I'm aware.
Well, just to say, if you had a, you know, I'm not saying a community necessarily like I told, but I guess what I'm saying is that the shadow work it seems to me that, and whilst there can be loads of bullshit around that, that is more promising than, say, that example that we gave of, say, the left woke thing, where, and I don't just mean concretely, do you like woke or don't you? I mean, like you said, there's this corrupt system, there's a reaction to it, and essentially it's the creation of another set of rules, which seems like a form of reconstituting, you know what I mean, in that constitutive thing. Like it's a mini revolution within a community of militants, right, that are protecting their sovereign space or whatever. Whereas the Eckhart Tolle thing, as just as a placeholder, seems to me more of a destitutive sort of power, because it's not trying to create this. Well, new...
I think, don't you think the defining factor is action? How much actual external action's taking place? So like this, if you've got, to use Eckhart Tolle as that example, and it only goes so far, but we both know what we mean with it. A reharmonizing, a recentering, a non-controlling, a non-ideological, a non-presumptive on external factors. Any of that is just right. So all that is, you kind of sense that that's good. It's just ideal, right? On at least on, you can argue that it's non-active enough. Some from a certain perspective, you could say, well, it's just sitting at the top of the hill under a tree. If you wanted to, I think that argument won't stand. But whereas when you've got action's the factor in that, to dampen this thing about the emergent communities and stuff as well, and that the inner sort of the fact that the same chaos is inside everyone and all that. One thing I've seen is you don't necessarily just have so a community that rises up, or an individual that stands up to criticize the corruption, the inherent corruption, the big scale corruption. There's an immediate appropriate irreverence for that corruption. Yeah, no, definitely an appropriate irreverence for that corruption. But straight away, and this is kind of what I mean by that slip of the tongue there, like immediately that is transposed into a hubris for yourself. If I've got irreverence for that, then I'm in a hubristic sort of, in terms of my own self, right? So there's a trap straight away. It's like I'm pointing out the corruption, but immediately there's a looking away from my own corruption, right? And you see, as a pattern I've seen repeatedly in individuals or communities, that's the immediate trap that should be looked at straight away, and that then you get like almost a next stage out of those individuals or communities that say, oh no, wait, I see what I was doing there. I was projecting what it is. It's about my shadow work, and I've got to do this. But then immediately those people, they catch on to that, but then they miss the next hubristic level of, look, I've got my shit together so much better than these people. And you get into this crazy, and this is just the further you get out of the Eckhart Tolle kind of thing that we're saying, and the more that you're in a pointing at the corruption.
Because he clearly doesn't do, I mean,
he doesn't play that game at all. He definitely doesn't play. I've never seen him play that game. So the point I'm
getting
at,
you get the sense that he genuinely doesn't think that. Do you know what I mean?
No, I think it's authentic. Yeah. It's either authentic or he has manifested it to such a degree that it's his character now, and it's egotistically held in place. I don't know, but he definitely expresses it this way. But the point I'm trying to make is that what's counterintuitive is the people who call the corruption out at that first level, they seem like the solution, and they end up being just another sort of trap and a part of the problem. And then the people who call those people out and say, you've really got to do your shadow work and recognize that you're just projecting onto those people out there. Those people, strangely, even though they're pointing at their shadow work, just because you're pointing at it and recognizing this is a big part of it, it's like that's the big final trap of your own hubris, because look how holy you are now, how superior you to everything. So those people have really got to look at, like, wait a minute, what's behind this game I'm playing that could be keeping me in this same deeply held psychological need to elevate myself, to have power over people, all that deep shit that is, that's at the root of all the problems of every individual and society there's ever been. So I think, and that's exactly why this comes back pretty well to what I was saying with the reverence thing. I think everything you were saying before about the way, viewing religion, looking at religion through sort of new eyes now, Knowing that everyone's coming from everyone I've ever met anyway, unless they've just been embedded in religion all their life, pretty much everyone I know has gone through a phase of, a serious contempt or at least irreverence for religious practice that is part of a sensible part of the journey, I think. But more and more people are coming back to this, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's played a certain role, even if just in a mythological sense, etc. And that's what we were just laying out in the first sort of part of this. And I think that's exactly right in terms of the way it overlaps with common law and everything. So we've got that side. Then the thing that I've often come back to about reverence, which, this spins out of everything I've just been saying. So that these two things, because they're kind of different, they overlap and they relate, but they can be held as sort of two twin pillars of benefit in the religious viewpoint or whatever, right? In the religious way of viewing the world. As soon as you're looking at something,
What's the twin pillars?
So looking at everything you were identifying and we were laying out in terms of the benefits of, how would you put, just to make this, make sure this is clear and I don't muddy the water, how would you put in a sentence the benefit of everything we've just been talking about in terms of religion, the religious impulse and religion and common law and all, it's interweaving of these things that serves as a counter to, not even so much as a counter to the corruption, but it actually serves as the fertile ground out of which any of these common law based benefits come from, right? It's kind of like, like you were saying, you can see that the religion is the source of that stuff. So I'm just pointing to that as being an inherent benefit of, shouldn't call it the religious impulse, but I suppose that maybe that is the best way to call it. So if out of the religious impulse comes all of the things we would point to as being the greatest moments in the Western history in terms of actual maintaining sovereignty. And
yeah, so long as it's funny this, if you allow me to, I even wonder whether, so Carl Schmitt says all secular concepts are theological concepts reanimated, right?
Yeah.
And the prime example that it gives, and this is not a metaphor, right? I can decide what it is after I say it, but he says sovereign is he who decides on the exception, and the exception is the exception to the nomos. The nomos are the laws.
Too many
right.
words that people don't know.
The law, it's just exception to the law. It's the state of exception, the ability to suspend the law. 9/11, COVID, right, etc. The sovereign gets to suspend his own laws, right? That is the miracle. That is God not being beholden to the laws of the universe that he has set in motion, right?
Yeah.
And this is a big theological debate. Like, you can go back and I don't know it well, but I've read secondary sort of things that have talked about this in the context. It's a problem for theologians. How can God that creates the laws also then anyway, that's by the by. But the point is that it is theological, and for Schmitt, that theology arrives at the state, right? And it's the state that gets to suspend the rule of law to create the miracle.
He's not making a value judgment, he's just saying it's a fact. It is the state that does that.
Well, I think he is making a value judgment.
It
should be able to, because laws only apply, I don't want to get too far in this, but laws only apply to a normal situation. This is nomos, norms.
Yeah.
And so if there's war, if the barbarians, all the stuff we've talked about, then this order of laws can't apply. But
then he's kind of saying, I don't want to do it either, but he is kind of saying then, this is just a fact of events.
He's saying that liberalism,
he's not calling it a moral good, he's saying it's just a natural fact.
Yeah, he's saying that there's a deep deception behind liberalism and its manifestation in positivist law, by which it means everyone's bound by the rule of law. And he's like, no, the sovereign isn't, just like God wasn't, right? There has to be, it's famous for what's called decisionism. There has to be a decision under conditions of existential threat.
Yeah.
Just as any law that we applied, if someone's coming at us with a knife, doesn't apply, right? You suspend that even at the personal level, and you do whatever's necessary.
Which all just points back to what common law and sovereignty being having primacy. If someone's coming at you with that knife, self-defense. I
Yeah,
get to
yeah, of
defend
course,
my life,
yeah.
never mind whatever. And that's enshrined into most laws. But
Yeah.
the point is, there are natural realities and facts
Yeah.
that trump everything.
And that it's very
Just in a
dynamic.
functional
Yeah, and it's very
way.
dynamic and fluid, and therefore, you know, a set of jurors would have to understand intent. They would have to, you know, why did you kill them? Who did you kill? Who were there? You know, there's a judgment then on, you know, that divine consciousness. That's the argument anyway.
Yeah.
But just to, so the only point, and I've not thought this through very much, but I find it very interesting. What is being said, because that is rejected by this common law place. The Schmittian idea is rejected in a sense, and I'm wondering almost like if Schmidt's state is more the Old Testament God, and in some ways the common law thing is more the Christ's coming, because yeah, it's kind of like you know, by putting the state below the people and by putting the people with a direct relation to God, as Jesus did, you know, my Father, my authority. The Roman law, the Roman state was corrupt, was oppressing the people, and he was like, I get my authority from God. These are the natural laws that I am speaking, etc., etc. And in this common law, in this sort of, if you like, this, you know, I take Schmidt's point, all secular concepts are theological concepts reanimated. You know, if we say that, okay, well, the common law system is to put the people above, to say there's a direct relationship with God, natural law, and that then those 12 jurors are manifesting the Christ consciousness in a way within the context of making that judgment on their peer, you know, within that context. And so I don't know if that's quite right, but I see that I find that, you know, one thing that's intriguing me is there a different branch of theological debate that's manifesting in these two different views, which are almost orthogonal? It's like, no, the state doesn't get to, like, one of the points this guy made was take the lockdown measures.
The guy talking about common law.
Yeah, take the lockdown measures. As soon as the Coronavirus Act materialised in the condition of, say, like, let's say a church that was being closed and that the police were coming, that priest says, no, I'm not closing. And the police say, right, we take you to prison. They say, right, I want a common court of law to be judged by my peers. And then the question that these peers should be asked, and those peers should be related to this person, like maybe other priests or whatever, but should, you know, understand that positionality. Then they're asked, if you decided to keep your church open, so like, let's remove the idea of COVID, blah, blah, blah. If you decided to keep your church open in the future for whatever reason, and the state and the police prevented you from doing so, you know, would that be just, because if you make this ruling now, if you judge this person to be guilty, then you're essentially case law creating that precedent that the state has the right to do that under whatever. Next time it might be, you name your kind of crisis or concocted crisis, right? So that, and then that's, if they then say no and they annul that, then they've essentially annulled the law, like, you know, and that case is the precedent, and if it comes again for another, then it's like, okay, well, we've already adjudicated this sort of thing. You know, this is a very, you know, you need other checks and balance, I'm sure, and like work out a better system, but at its core, and that is therefore putting those jurors as sort of sovereign in a sense. And there's a whole, and I find it intriguing, there's this whole school of thought where, you know, there's a book called Democracy Defined, where actually, to say Parliament is sovereign is in some way treasonous to, like, actually, you know, the people are sovereign, because what you always hear the people are sovereign, but then we have representatives, the representatives go to Parliament's sovereign, it makes the laws, and that's deemed to be the way in which the people are sovereign, where we are both governed but also govern, you know, this kind of contradiction. But, you know, you know, all the, just from, you know, even with an ideal view of that, you know, without any corruption or whatever, it's a very limited sort of sense of sovereignty, you know, of the people being sovereign. And then if you put it in the current context where, you know, as George Galloway said, the left bum cheek and the right bum cheek, you know, but they're the same ass sort of thing, then like, you know, you literally don't have a choice. The whole thing's a joke. And I can see then why the actual common law version of that, where, You know, because think about it, how democratic is it? Like, jurors are just selected at random usually. I mean, you know, forget about this thing I was saying with priests. Like, I don't know enough detail about what the actual claims and the ideal type are, but in principle, as it's applied now, jurors are selected at random. So people talk about democracy and say the most pure form would be like that. Literally, MPs are, you know, you pull the straw, and that's you know, a pure equality of people, not based on these notions of merit and privilege and corrupt forms of privilege and so on. Well, that's how jurors are picked. And then they're also, you know, from a sort of civics point of view, you know, they have to start taking shit seriously. Do you know what I mean? You have to rise up as like a kind of, you know, and start thinking about values and principles and et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, I won't bang on about it, but I think that whole theological aspect of that is kind of interesting. You asked me to do it in a sentence, and I've not even done what you said. So sorry, where were you going with it now?
Still good stuff. No, all I was saying was that there's, I'm just to give some definition to the whole conversation that I think is worthy. We've got there is. I'd say to most people, there's a background assumption that, you know, religion, right? A lot of people are still in that sort of state of mind, and I think then there's a few people, there's a lot of people who've gone the Jordan Peterson route, and they're saying, oh, wait a minute, it's a powerful myth, and if I'm better off in my life and I live a more fruitful life for myself and the people around me, and I move ahead and I evolve quicker and I become a better person, and all this as a result of this myth that I don't really believe, but it's a great myth, then maybe that's all right. And then they kind of come back that way, and then there's the next level of sort of where Jordan Peterson puts it, which is, I think the way he phrased it is, someone asked him if he believes the literal truth, and he said, I act like I do. I try to think and condition myself like I do, which is just like a solidification of that previous thing. It's like I want to delude myself, or, you know, I want to overpower myself with the idea, because I recognize that the degree to which I live like it's true is the degree to which I will be able to manifest these values. So then you're there. And sitting on a similar, I'd say almost parallel to that, there's then recognizing everything you've just been talking about there, and everything that's been the main sort of crux of what we've been on about, which is that if you don't utilize the mechanisms and human proclivities towards wanting a God, or being able to manifest religious ideas, if you don't find a mythology for it, the state will provide you with one, or other structures, or the church, shitty expressions of the church will provide you with one. So it's sort of recognizing it as a basically revivifying the idea of religion. Like I don't often go to that, because I'm totally satisfied with the idea of revivifying and revaluing the idea of reverence. I see reverence, just the reverence and its escape from its antonym of hubris. I see that as being enough usually, or at least sort of trumps everything else, right? And that's for all the reasons I alluded to a little bit, but I've spoke about before, that as soon as you've just to not have to escape hubris and have reverence, takes you out of the judgment loop for a start. You know, you're immediately in the forgiveness loop instead of the judgment loop. You're not pointing at someone and saying, you're shitty, I've got it figured out. You're saying, all the sins and shit that exists in you exists in me. And that goes all the way to pointing at Henry Kissinger and anyone else, and while judging them appropriately and seeing what they're responsible for, you're saying you wouldn't be the way you are if you didn't, you know, I escaped this shitty childhood you clearly had, or like living as a Jew escaping World War II and all the crazy shit that poor guy had to deal with when he was still...
Is that right?
He came back, yeah, it was definitely, wasn't he a Polish refugee?
Right, okay.
Not Polish, is he Polish?
I don't know.
So, I'm sorry,
anyway.
I should know, I'm ignorant, but he definitely, his family lived right through it, and he arrived in America as a 7-year-old or
probably
something.
Old enough, isn't he?
He's the right age.
Is he dead now? But he got to
He's
about
dead,
100.
Yeah. He was definitely, he definitely had a traumatic youth, right? And and they all do. Like that, it's like you don't need to even slowly assess it. Of course they do. Otherwise they wouldn't act in an inhumane way. Like what they're doing is they're acting in a self-serving, psychologically broken way. Like any psychopath that goes out and hits a prostitute over the head with a hammer because he's so power deprived in his own existence. I'm talking about Peter Sutcliffe, obviously, but so whether it's psychopaths or politicians or whatever, and that reverent understanding for that, and that forgiving understanding for that, the idea of reverence takes you out of your own hubris, applies forgiveness to other people in a productive, actionable way, not just whimsical or airy-fairy forgiveness, as a lot of Christianity ended up seeming to be and how it ends up being expressed. Forgiveness is a meekness, like a weakness, really, instead of it being, I recognize the social reality of why you are what you are and how I would be what you are if I were born in your situation. So I see reverence as doing that, it's escaping the hubris, building the forgiveness, and also embedding you back in nature, having reverence for nature. You know, what's behind that? Kissinger is doing that because Mother Nature is saying to him, you know what, you can't trust, this world is cruel to you, you better be tough to it. Never mind this open-hearted humanitarianism, you're going to die. If you be a humanitarian while the Nazis are chasing you down that street, you're dead. So it's saying, become a vicious piece of shit. And then you take that vicious piece of shit and you give him a huge amount of political power and you have the fucking world that we've got. So I think when the recognition of the natural situation that's taking place, even to the elements of a parasitical, monopolistic elite that we're sort of talking about generally, the recognition that nature is the presiding force here, and having reverence for that, even, you know, it takes you out of that evil loop that we talked about before. You're not now pointing at and saying it's evil. You're saying, oh, this is a response to environment, and then you're empowered to change the environmental factors that could adjust this situation instead of you just being caught in an evil. Let me just finish this thing. Instead of you being caught in an evil loop, in a reactionary sort of dichotomy of me bad, you good, me good, you bad. For all that, that's why reverence. That's in a nutshell why I kind of come back to reverence. That's my core thing. I'll just come back to as my rudder, like as my fail-safe, you know, like I'm not going to, down that road of reverence, I'm never going to look back and say, you know, that reverent approach to life really made me fuck that person over that time or whatever. It's kind of a panacea, I think, in a way. I'm yet to find a way that it doesn't even inspire non-action and withdrawal. It's an active approach to your reality and all the rest of it. So I usually that's my religious position, if you like, if you want to call it religious position. And then everything we've been talking about, and you sort of introduced in this, and talking about the chapter you're speaking about common law and all the rest of it, has loads of overlap with that, but it's also slightly different as well. It's another side to it. So I think out of everything I've just babbled about there, everything we've been talking about generally, you've got two interesting and unquestionably, I think, valuable ways of looking at what religion is and what religion does, and the role it's played.
When you say two, you mean the reverence for nature?
My whole general riff there about reverence for nature, the imposition of forgiveness and how it does that.
Because I wonder how separate they are, but carry on.
Yeah, they're massively intertwined, but I think just in the sense that you can, that even if you just did put it in a sentence and just said
God is nature, right? So,
and I agree. But if you just to say, I'm meaning more for someone watching this, who's saying what value could religion ever be to me, I could do that whole little reverence kick there, and you could be like, that makes sense, hopefully, and then and then you could say, and it would seem distinct enough. You think you could then say, and also, have you considered the way that the religious impulse and the appeal to sovereignty and common law and individual and all the rest of it, but also to a power outside of you that even if you're just enshrining that in common law. Have you considered the way that this impulse also has generated a lot of the social good that's been done in society, right? So you could just throw those two things out as two ways that you shouldn't really just throw religion out full stop. Put those there. So on that basis, that's enough.
Or that there's a deceit even if you tried to, because actually, this is the thing around all secular concepts.
You have that need.
So if there's archetypal,
and it comes back to the nature thing, right? Yeah. So you have that need. You're never going to get rid of that need. This is a really good. I don't want to digress, Gabriel. I want to get to my thing, but I think I can't help but throw it in because it's such a good expression of it. It's Paul Thomas Anderson, I think. You know, the Master. Have you seen that? It's
No.
another film you'd love, and it's essentially a lot of what's at the core of the film is the idea of like choose your master. Don't try to not have a master. Is suffering, is pain, is disenfranchisement, is estrangement. Choose your master and choose wisely, kind of thing. What are you? If you don't choose your master, a master will appear in your life that you have then put that momentum, added that momentum to, kind of thing. So what I would say is, with all that in mind, as a, if you like, as a spiel for why religion might have value to an extremely secular generation of people that have no real valuation of it, and still in that stuck in that sort of Nietzschean first stage of throw the baby out with the bathwater and then go outside and maybe find something of value after that.
Nihilism, isn't it? As well?
Yeah.
Or can you create
And it's
your
not.
own
Yeah, I
values?
shouldn't be cruel to Nietzsche. Really, it is more like the original nihilistic thing, which is where a lot of people still are, I think.
Yeah, well, that was his fear. Yeah, that
Yeah.
we just live. Nihilism would take over.
Yeah,
because God was dead.
Exactly.
The founding principle.
Exactly.
And his whole project was how do we kind of, reevaluation of all values. How do we?
Yeah.
And that's how you get
And it is,
existentialism coming out of it. Like we are responsible for our own.
The whole postmodernist
reality
is exactly a result of what he predicted
Yeah.
and what he was writing about. And you couldn't get. There's basically nothing in anything we're talking about here that isn't sort of weaved into all Nietzsche's kind of work, really. So I mean that's enough just to say here are two things, right, that are worth contemplating. A question I'd throw in there would be like, where is the line in this where there's out of the two, let's say two religions emerge. Like if we're gonna move forward on the basis that there is value in that, at least those two, and maybe there's other things we're not looking at, but looking at those two factors, right? And then we consider on the basis of a growing need for this, which is what we're identifying here, is this is an unavoidable emergent thing. It will happen. As corruption rises, the need for this will rise, and the religious impulse will come back stronger than it's ever been in our lifetimes, and in probably a long time beyond that. Let's say now two religions emerge, and one of them is more of a, I won't say fanatical, but it's more of a, we have the bearded guy on the cloud. It's a personified, kind of monotheistic religion, the way that we sat in church on a Sunday, right? And then the other one is a kind of not even as religious as Jordan Peterson had even put in the middle of these two things, but the other one being a very the sort of religion, if me and you were writing the tenets of it, where there's no requirement in an actual literal belief in some deity. This is now like a sort of a humanist expression of all these tendencies and facts, religious facts, and this whole master reality and choosing your own sort of thing to be beneath and holding sovereign, and your own diminishment of hubris for reverence for the natural order and all this stuff. Just recognizing that these aren't just ideals, they're facts that we can't avoid, and they're going to manifest some other way if we don't choose how they're manifesting. So let's say me and you created our fucking 10 Commandments, right? The tablets. So you've got this one that would be a hyper, almost too rational, and this is kind of the point I'm making, because further down this end of the spectrum loses mythological power, loses that really, getting into the bottom of that human brain of salvationism, of wanting someone to rescue you, of wanting a father figure. There's a lot of these things that are weaved into it, right? And the more rational it is at this end of the spectrum, it loses that stuff. And then at this end of the spectrum, it loses loses rationality, but gains all these mythological benefits of capitalizing on these psychological frailties, vagaries, whatever, of human psychology, right? If those two religions emerged out of this, what we're arguing might be a slow shift now towards a reevaluation of religion. Which one? Well, can you put a value judgment on them first? And secondly, what I'd propose is the one that appeals, the mythological one, the one that's a little bit more bearded guy in the cloud, deification of an individual, monotheism, all that. would outperform the other one because it's playing by the exact rule that's embedded in everything we've been talking about. It's playing by the rule of your 80% of what's governing your actions is this repressed psychology and all the rest of it. Now, is that not, is that, well, I'm only asking questions here, like, is that a reason to more value this up the Jordan Peterson end of the scale? And does it get you to a real rational position in him saying, I act like it's true? And he's stopping just short of saying, yes, I believe there's a God in heaven. He's stopping just short of that. And maybe he's right. Maybe that's where you need to be, because to gain the superior firepower of this funny analogy, but the superior firepower of that worldview, that religious view, which you're going to need because you won't survive just as a highly almost secularized version of these ideas, you're going to have to play around those edges. And that's all I want to say. Just like, and I think it's a good kind of, I'll see what you say about it in response, but I think the overall thing we've been talking about, which the pattern seems to be like, is this a thing that's going to get more and more? We can see the value in it in these two ways we've expressed it. Where does it go, and how can you what is the best way to predict what the next thing then would be? If we can see that that's going to happen, what would be the next big challenge in that situation? And it seems like all the people I know who've ever swung a bat for some kind of religious perspective, I'd be interested to know that the comments between these two, what seem to me the obvious expressions of it that we're going to get in this age.
Yeah, I mean, like prediction wise, I don't know, but I guess from sort of values wise, normatively, like, I mean, I honestly don't think there's a coming back from the death of God. I think Nietzsche knew that, like, when he proclaimed it, like, this is. So I mean, I guess in a way,
there's a lot of Christians, and they're getting a lot more.
They're getting armed.
I've seen more people becoming devoutly religious in the last year, like young people. 20-year-old people, I've seen it myself with my eyes 2 or 3 times, and I've heard of it quite a lot. Of people saying, have you heard about so-and-so? Oh no, she's going to church every Sunday and she is fanatical. She is like she's devout and trying to convert everyone. I've never heard of that in my entire life, and now it's actually a thing again, and it's because people respond out of fear.
Age, though. Maybe if
but they're kids. These are people in their early 20s, which is what I find even more bizarre.
Yeah. I guess.
And I only just to bookend that, like, and I think it's fear. It's a result of the diminishment of stability and security in our way of life. People are, if they don't see it on the surface level and they're happy to just go to the job and they're going to ignore the COVID situation and everything else, on a subconscious level, there's a thing ticking away at them saying, we're in trouble. You're in trouble. Find something to be safe in, and it pushes you towards in all those directions.
Paul Kingsnorth, isn't he? He's gone back to, I think it's some brand of Catholicism.
What a brilliant example! Like, I would say if I was going to pick someone who is demonstrably further down my general trail of thought, and I'd respect his views, and I'm kind of, this is why it scares me that he's gone full Catholic, right?
I think it's Catholic, yeah.
So it's not even like some sort of Protestant expression. He's gone full Catholic. And that guy's never, in his last, I've never read anything I don't agree with that he's said. He speaks on all the same sort of terms that we're kind of speaking on. He's kind of right in that zone, and now he's a Catholic, and I've got to figure that out. Like, and I've got to at least consider the possibility that that's something I'm going to be looking at in some way. Yeah. And I think that's probably what this whole conversation is. It's me trying to find a way of having some secular version of that, so I don't have to be a fucking Catholic.
Well, I guess if I understood you properly, I think the point you were making is that the more secularized versions of those are not powerful enough, and
mythologically,
because and
well, that's why sorry, but that's when you said I think the death of God, we're not coming back from that. What brings us back from that is that bringing God back gives you more power against those secularized versions of this.
Yeah, and obviously, if you take, for example, on the geopolitical level, it's similar to Francis Fukuyama announcing the end of history, just because these two, again, somewhat religious ideologies between, the Western communism or whatever, that fizzled out at the end of the Cold War, and then, but what you saw then, again, however contrived or whatever, which in my reading is that there was clearly a lot of meddling that fermented some of the more fundamentalist aspects of Islam as a mechanism of control and division and so on. But anyway,
we definitely in that exact period we definitely switched from a very powerful message of one to a very powerful message of the other without even a beat.
Yeah, the war on terror.
Yeah,
you know,
straight
and
into
even though
who am I supposed to hate? It was like there was one day when I didn't have to hate anyone, and then suddenly these people are here.
Yeah. So, but anyway, in any case, sort of, you know, the more mainstream narrative is, you know, religion had a resurgence, right? We've not quite, you know, pursued the Enlightenment to its zenith point that we originally hoped we had when the Berlin Wall fell down and blah blah. You know, they were essentially, if you take the liberalism versus communism, they're two Enlightenment projects, right? Marxism and liberalism. And therefore liberalism was supposed to have won crowning glory. Oh no, there's this barbarian religious sort of, you know. Anyway, so, you know, there's that, but I, you know, about the death of God. Yeah. I don't think, you know, I'll take your point around there's people that are going and finding, I know some as well, I just don't think sort of writ large it will do. And then there's a question as to these other sort of more new age stuff, but some of it's not even new age. I mean, have you seen that? Is it John Vanecka, who's like a cognitive scientist, and he's done a whole really long series. It's, I really do want to rewatch it. I started and kind of drifted off, but the whole series is called Reawakening from the Meaning Crisis. And he's going through all the different, what he called psychotechnologies that have been used by ancients, you know, looking at different philosophical traditions,
meditation
moving all the way through. Yeah, but like much more than that. So whether there'll be, sort of new age communities that really ground themselves in some of those psychotechnologies. But I think your question was, is that really powerful enough? And in a way, we come back to kind of biopolitics, right? Because is this, you know, biopolitics was at one level the result of the death of God, or you know, or you could reinterpret that as the end of metaphysics in terms of trying to have a foundation.
Well, life is what matters at that point. Survival.
Yeah, because
staying alive.
You've lost all founding. Like you've talked about nature, right? If people adopted that would be a new founding principle. You know, it would be a principle that kind of tries to order. The Enlightenment believed reason could sort of step into that. You know, God died, but we've got reason, and you know that, especially with say postmodernism and you know that foundation couldn't hold. It couldn't like support the edifice that it claimed to be able to. You know, you end up with scientism and technocracy, you know, all these kind of things that come out of that. And even, in fact, you know, there's good arguments. And in fact, Adorno and Horkheimer in, Dialectics of Enlightenment, you know, kind of postulate that, you know, Nazism also was the kind of, you know, that kind of bureaucratic rationalization, et cetera, et cetera. So but you know, in a way, biopolitics sort of emerges out of that, and is there something strong enough to, or will it just be these little, you know, micro groups of people adopting one thing? And even if they do adopt that, is it strong enough in the face of real pressure? You know, are you going to be the monk that can kind of just, you know,
and then additional point,
self-immolate if it comes to it, you know, because it's just like, right, this is the last move on the chessboard. Sort of thing.
So point number one was is there a problem with, you know, you almost need the more dogmatic, you think of the fanatical tribe charging across the battlefield for the death kind of thing for them, right? So like that extreme, can anything beat that because that fanaticism can sweep, because it gets right to that reptile brain. Point number one. Point number two, to push back the other way a little bit, if the biggest threat of our age and the coming age is in the biopolitical sphere, or at least even in other comparably defined spheres that are emboldened and built upon the biopolitical sphere age that we're living through now. So if we move into,
which I think
if we move,
security,
we're moving through that into the
of
digital contagion and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But like the mentalities that exist behind the biopolitical, and it will, all that other stuff will always be built on it. You can argue. If in that way, the biopolitical power is the antagonist of humanity in this era, then, and if that sphere only manifests as a result of the death of God, if you like, well then he's bringing God back, the best single defense there is to diminish the power of the biopolitical forces that are shaping everyone's lives. And if it is, well then the emphasis should be on either side of that spectrum, where wherever you fit, kind of thing. But then it's funny how we come all the way here to a justification to throw your weight behind fanatical religion. Not fanatical, but you know what I mean. To throw your weight behind inherently. I shouldn't say fanatical, because the emphasis with fanatical, the emphasis is somewhere else. But what I mean is, you come back to a rational reason why you would want to support religious ideas. I can see Sam Harris like trying to punch me in the side of the head as I'm talking. I love it, but that whole thing of Sam Harris is like the disgust at the stupidity and how can we be that stupid? But it's missing the point. It's first of all leaving aside the fact that it's gonna happen. It's never mind whether you think it's good. You're not looking at it right. Whether you value it or not, it's a psychological construct that's going to come in response to this stuff. But even that aside, the idea that I've just slowly built at least one argument for why, if I saw that religion sweeping across in the way that the Christians swept across Greece, pulled all those old ideas out of the sort of rational philosophical basis for Western civilization, and it's not that it destroyed it all, and in that kind of the Mongol hordes kind of a way. But it definitely shifted the emphasis away from certain ways of being to more knee-jerk responsive ways of being in terms of the authority speaking down to me and all that. That if I saw that happening now, if I was really going to get behind the kind of gist of what I've been saying, I'd see it as like, well, this is a good thing, because it's not good inherently, but the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and there's nothing more powerful at diminishing this biopolitical total entrenchment in a desire for survival at all costs, and no matter everything that's at the root of all the problems. And to really understand what we're saying here, you kind of have to go through everything we've gone through over the with all the episodes. But it's all the reasons why. Take it as read that the structures of biopolitical power are the problem, the main problem we've got right now. Assuming that's the case, well then, if there's the most potent response to that could diminish it, could be something that, despite it being irrational, counter enlightenment and all this stuff, could be something you want to jump behind, because if you don't jump behind that in a less oppressive form, well then it's going to emerge somewhere else. This is kind of what I mean. It's like I'm fusing those two things now. Unless you got behind that kind of ideological deification of some god, kind of something that's got the mythological power to sweep the planet like that, unless you get behind a rational one or create the rational one first, it will emerge somewhere, and it'll probably emerge in the form of fanatical Islam or fanatical Christianity that we haven't seen yet, or whatever, to the same degree.
I mean, this is a bit of a contradiction in a way, because you can, if you're saying, actually there needs to be that kind of belief, that's more powerful than any kind of rational critique. But then we're going to apply a rational critique to it. That's it. So I'm going to apply a rational thing as to what would be preferable. I guess from this, going back to what we started at the start around sovereignty, and again, I'm caveating this by I don't know the history well enough, but this would be the simplistic reading. Like, if the Protestant ethic transformed the relationship to God, that rather than being mediated through a hierarchical church structure that was, like you said at the start, it was, is it the church or state? Like, at one level they were doing the same function, and then they kind of, crossed each other. And
It was definitely closer to the Roman Empire than it was to some like Eckhart Tolle's gang in the
yeah.
woods. Yeah.
So I guess for a brief period, and I mean this is in Weber's Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Like, put capitalism to one side, but you know, the point being that the religious ideas that I guess was just as fervently held to as Catholicism were that actually God has made us free, but nevertheless our free will and the manifestation of our free will is an indication from God. You know, the success of that free will is an indication from God as to who's going to be saved and who isn't, like salvation. So that's apparently what was believed, like that those that were more, in that case, sort of, that's why he says the ethic of capitalism, those that were kind of more successful materially in the realm were it was an indication of salvation. You've got then a weird shit going on, right, where do you know what I mean? Yeah. Where it's actually based on free will, but it's preordained from the outset. You know, how you reconcile that, I'm sure you need some complex theological argumentation, but in any case, if that was then a significant foundation for the sovereign individual, like we were saying at the start, and you know, those complex relationships of internal voices and the notion of a soul, which then maybe merges into the Freudian subconscious, or you know, etc., etc. Like, it seems to me now that is let's say dying out, under threat, dying out, because there's no longer a foundation to hold it. And whilst liberalism might have been a secular enshrining of some of those things, and you know, shifting it from a theological into a secular, it you know, on the same basis that there isn't that strength of principle, it's now seemingly being eroded by the biopolitical securitization. You know, we're all just risk matrices within a technocratic system. We no longer a divine human being ordained from God that has that integrity.
God could just be nature
within the ideological system. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, I wouldn't want a kind of, I would want some version of that, because it's then, you know, if I was being rational about it, because it maintains that individual sovereignty rather than, you know, because what is biopolitics after all, right? It's based on the model of the pastor and the flock, and you know, the pastoral tradition. Like Foucault even like sort of makes the analogy. I mean, because it's operating at a population level. It would have to be a religion. It would have to be a religion that, or one would want it to be a religion that enshrines that kind of.
So too, right? So like,
we'll have to wrap
yeah, no.
up,
Well,
so,
this wraps it up. So we could to bring this back as well, to loop this back to everything with the idea that we've come back to over and over again of creating your own, casting your own vote for your own kind of your own perception of your reality. Otherwise, someone will create one for you. Create your own version of reality.
Create your own roadshow.
Create your own expression of reality. Cast your vote in that. Otherwise, some powerful actor will pull you into their thing. There's obviously a correlation here with, is it something that people should consider and take seriously, that unless you consider, select, and to some degree manifest a version of your religious impulse, and that is a broad thing, but unless you do that, even if you have a little statue of Gandalf and you've got 5 values, whatever it is someone's got, because it's an impulse, right? Find your own expression of that impulse. Otherwise, because the assumption is you don't find your own, dismiss them all. But the assumption is that then you don't have one. Whereas the reality is you're being governed by certain leanings that will always manifest it in some other means, or you'll lean into somebody else's expression of it. So is it true to say that you find your own expression of the religious impulse, or you'll find yourself somehow living through someone else's, even though it might seem very secular, but you're still beholden to the exact same kinds of manipulations as you would have been.
Yeah, and it's intriguing to bring it full circle. It's intriguing that by these groups, and or at least some of them, that the common law system is being revivified with a kind of, because it's like the Protestant ethic. You're free to do what you want.
Yeah.
You're free to experience. You've got these inalienable rights that are quote unquote God given, or the creator that you were created with, you were born to have. And then this is the system of sort of, this is the divine judgment, amongst your other divine beings, your peers or whatever. So maybe that's enough.
So we are living through apocalypse, basically. It's just revelation.
Yeah.